Until Roman times, all glass was expensive, it was difficult to make, the techniques of forming glass were laborious, and everything was small and luxurious. All that changed in early Roman times, when somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, the technique of glass blowing was discovered. Glass blowing changed everything. In the 1st century BC, glass workers discovered that by blowing through a tube, one could inflate a gather of molten glass on the end of the tube, and as it inflated, one could shape it to whatever size and form one wanted. The technique was inexpensive, and if one used inexpensive, unrefined raw materials, glassware could suddenly be made affordable, made in large quantities, in other words, made for everyday common or garden use. And these 4 bottles of green glass were made to be used in the house. They were domestic products, and this is the first time in the history of glassmaking that inexpensive glass flooded the market, and many hundreds of thousands of glass vessels, probably millions, were used all over the Roman Empire for all kinds of purposes in the house.